August 2003. In a converted loft space in Montreal's Mile End neighborhood, a collection of musicians huddle around makeshift recording equipment during one of the hottest weeks of summer. Outside, the city pulses with life. Inside, the air hangs heavy with something else entirely: grief. Over the past few months, death has visited these young artists repeatedly. A grandmother in June. Family members across the band losing loved ones in a pattern that feels almost biblical. And still to come, in February 2004, the passing of Alvino Rey, swing-era pioneer, electric guitar innovator, and grandfather to two of the band's core members. They don't know it yet, but they're about to create one of the most influential albums of the 21st century. An album that will sell over 750,000 copies worldwide. An album that will earn a Grammy nomination and appear on virtually every critic's year-end list. An album that will transform the indie rock landscape so completely that music would never quite be the same. The album is called Funeral, and it was recorded during a week in August 2003 at Montreal's Hotel Two Tango studio. The production cost was estimated at around $10,000. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Arcade Fire's. To understand Funeral, you have to understand Montreal in the early 2000s, a city where French and English collided, where rent was cheap enough for artists to survive, and where winter was so brutal it forced people to create simply to stay sane. Win Butler and Josh Dew founded Arcade Fire in Montreal around 2001, having first met at Phillips Exeter Academy as high school students. Butler was born in Truckee, California and raised in the Woodlands, Texas, with a Latter-day Saint upbringing. His path to music seemed almost inevitable. His maternal grandfather was jazz steel guitarist Alvino Rey, a pioneer bandleader whose career spanned 8 decades, and his maternal grandmother Louise was a member of the King Sisters. Butler moved to Montreal, Quebec, Canada in 2000 to attend McGill University, where he met his future wife, Régine Chassagne. Chassagne was born in Montreal and grew up in Saint-Lambert, a suburb south of Montreal. Her parents, who were Haitians of mixed French and African descent, moved from Haiti during the dictatorship of François Duvalier. Chassagne attended Collège Jean de Brébeuf before earning a BA in Communication Studies at Concordia University in 1998, and went on to study jazz voice briefly at McGill University. Before Arcade Fire, she had been involved in multiple musical projects, a medieval-themed band called Les Jongleurs de la Mandragore, and with Jimmy Rouleau in the jazz duo Azoukar. Butler and Dew's musical ideas began to develop, and the first incarnation of the band was born while they were attending McGill University and Concordia University, respectively. The duo began rehearsing their material at McGill, where they met Régine Chassagne, a music student whom they asked to join them. The chemistry was immediate. Win Butler married Régine Chassagne in 2003, shortly after they finished recording what would become Funeral. Their partnership, musical and romantic, would become the heart of Arcade Fire. The early lineup was fluid. At early shows, the band consisted of future husband and wife Win Butler and Régine Chassagne, singer, guitarist, collaborator and original band co-founder Josh Dew, bassist Miles Brosco, guitarist drummer Dane Mills, and multi-instrumentalist Brendan Reed. Win's younger brother William Butler would soon join, along with Richard Reed Perry on multiple instruments, Tim Kingsbury on bass, and Howard Billerman on drums and engineering. In the summer of 2002, Arcade Fire briefly went to Maine to record an EP, since frontman Win Butler's parents had recently moved there after his father got a land conservatory job. The following year, the band self-released the EP on their website and at their shows. This self-titled EP, unofficially known as Us Kids Know, would be their calling card as they began shopping for a proper record deal. The year leading up to Funeral was marked by loss that no young band should have to endure. The album was given its title because several band members had recently lost members of their families. Régine Chassagne's grandmother died in June 2003, Win and William Butler's grandfather, swing musician Alvino Rey, in February 2004, and Richard Reed Perry's aunts in April 2004. Alvino Rey's death hit the Butler brothers particularly hard. Rey, originally Alvin McBurney, was hired to produce the pickup that was used by Gibson in their first electric guitar, the popular ES-150. Rey is also credited with creating the first talkbox. At the height of the swing band era, Rey's genre-busting fretwork in electric music's nascent years helped set the stage for modern rock. Will Butler, Win's younger brother, described their grandfather's funeral in moving terms. "His funeral was really kind of amazing," Will Butler said, describing how his great-aunts and other relatives performed. "It was just this really wonderful celebration that really circled around music and family. I don't know if I'd been to any funerals at that point, and it was a powerful experience. The parallels between grandfather and grandson weren't lost on the family. Alvino lived with his wife and ran a band, and now Win lives with his wife and runs a band, Will Butler said. They were musicians and had a family and had a larger musical family around them. It was a common cause, that's very apropos to us. But amid the grief, there was also new life. Marriages were being celebrated. The band was coming together creatively in ways that felt almost spiritual. This juxtaposition, death and life, endings and beginnings, would permeate every moment of the album they were about to record. The first half of the album, dubbed the Neighborhood Suite, centers around a town struggling with a power outage in the middle of winter based on personal experience during the North American ice storm of 1998. The 1998 ice storm was a catastrophe that defined a generation of Montrealers. The North American ice storm of 1998 struck a relatively narrow swath of land from eastern Ontario to southern Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia in Canada, and bordering areas from northern New York to central Maine in the United States. It caused massive damage to trees and electrical infrastructure throughout the area, leading to widespread long-term power outages. Many power lines broke and over 1,000 transmission towers collapsed in chain reactions under the weight of the ice, leaving more than 4 million people without electricity, most of them in southern Quebec, western New Brunswick, and eastern Ontario, some of them for an entire month. For Win Butler and Régine Chassagne, who were teenagers in the Montreal area during the storm, the experience was formative. The storm claimed as many as 35 lives, injured 945, and resulted in the temporary displacement of 600,000 people. Several roads were shut down and massive power outages occurred, cutting off electricity for nearly 1.4 million customers in Quebec and over 230,000 in eastern Ontario. At its peak, 3.5 million Quebecers, roughly half of Quebec's population, and more than 1 million Ontarians, as well as thousands in New Brunswick, were left in the dark, many for several weeks. This collective trauma, the darkness, the cold, the sense of civilization's fragility, became the emotional backdrop for the album's opening suite of songs. Neighborhood Number 1, Tunnels, Neighborhood Number 2, Laika, Neighborhood Number 3, Power Out, and Neighborhood Number 4, Seven Kettles, all draw from this experience of communities struggling through darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Funeral was largely recorded over the course of a week at the Hotel Tutango in Montreal, Quebec in August 2003. Additional recording also took place at Régine Chassagne and Win Butler's apartment, and the album was completed in 2004. Hotel Tutango wasn't a fancy studio. It was a converted loft space run by members of the Montreal music collective Godspeed You Black Emperor. The aesthetic was lo-fi, the equipment was analog, and the approach was collaborative. The album was recorded in an analog recording format. The band worked with intense focus during that August week. Régine Chassagne performed vocals, drums, synthesizer, piano, accordion, xylophone, recorders, and percussion. Richard Reed Parry played electric guitar, synthesizer, organ, piano, accordion, xylophone, percussion, double bass, and handled engineering and recording. Tim Kingsbury played bass, electric guitar, and acoustic guitar. Howard Bielerman played drums and guitar and served as engineer. The multi-instrumental approach wasn't just aesthetic, it was practical. With limited resources and time, band members had to be versatile. Chassagne plays many instruments on stage, including accordion, drums, xylophone, hurdy-gurdy, keyboards, organ, and guitar. One technical accident became one of the album's signature sounds. The iconic guitar sound on Neighborhood Number 1, Tunnels, was an accident, giving the track an ethereal, nostalgic quality that has defined the band's sound ever since. Another key element came from outside collaboration. Wake Up owes its bombastic sound to Wolf Parade. When a drummerless Arcade Fire set up to record what would eventually become the album's emotional denouement, Butler drafted Wolf Parade drummer Arlen Thompson to give the song its orotund presence. The recording process was intimate and emotional. These weren't just songs, they were eulogies, love letters, cries of defiance against mortality. Every track carried the weight of recent loss, transformed into something transcendent. With the album recorded, Arcade Fire faced a crucial decision: who would release it? Arcade Fire met with record labels like Alien 8, Absolutely Kosher, and Merge Records to release their debut album Funeral. The band eventually signed with Merge since frontman Win Butler liked bands such as Magnetic Fields and Neutral Milk Hotel, who had previously signed with them. Butler said he felt really comfortable with Merge, but denied that there was an indie label bidding war. Merge Records, based in North Carolina, was the perfect fit. Founded by members of Superchunk, the label had built its reputation on artist-friendly deals and championing independent music. For Arcade Fire, signing with Merge meant creative control and alignment with a label that understood their vision. But even Merge couldn't have predicted what was about to happen. Funeral was released in Canada and the US on September 14, 2004, and in the UK on February 28, 2005. In 2004, the music industry was in flux. Traditional media was struggling to understand independent music. Radio largely ignored it. MTV had moved away from music videos. But a new force was emerging: online music journalism, and specifically a website called Pitchfork. Also in 2004, Pitchfork published a positive review of the debut album by Arcade Fire, Funeral. The album became a bestseller and is cited as the first major example of Pitchfork's influence on independent music, attracting coverage of Pitchfork from outlets such as the Los Angeles Times. A highly positive review from Pitchfork, which gave the album a 9.7 out of 10 rating, was frequently cited as a key factor that propelled Funeral into widespread recognition and commercial success. After Pitchfork awarded 9.7 to the debut album by Arcade Fire, Funeral, 2004, it became the fastest-selling record in the history of Merge Records. The review's impact was immediate and dramatic. The Pitchfork review ran several days before the release, and it directly resulted in many record stores being unable to keep Funeral in stock. In an era before streaming, this meant fans had to wait days or even weeks to hear the album everyone was talking about. The writer of that legendary 9.7 review later reflected on the moment's significance. In a podcast interview years later, he discussed the deliberate choice of the score. He wanted to give it a 10, but settled on 9.7 because, in his words, it doesn't get to be worse than Blueberry Boat, the Fiery Furnaces album that had received 9.6, and it can't be better than Moon and Antarctica, Modest Mouse's album rated 9.8. The album entered the Billboard 200 chart, a first for Merge Records. It was also the fastest seller in the label's history. The Pitchfork review wasn't an outlier. Critics across the spectrum recognized something special. At Metacritic, the album has received an average score of 90 based on 33 reviews. It is put at one of the top 100 albums on Metacritic's list of highest-scored albums of all time. AllMusic reviewer James Christopher Munger gave the album a rating of 5 stars out of 5. He described it as brave, empowering, and dusted with something that many of the indie rock genre's more contrived acts desperately lack: an element of real danger. Rock critic Robert Christgau gave the album an A, saying that Funeral was too fond of drama, but aware of its small place in the big world and usually beautiful. Pitchfork ultimately ranked the album number 1 on their top 50 albums of 2004 list, as well as number 2 on their top 200 albums of the 2000s list, after Radiohead's Kid A. Drowned in Sound reviewer Jesus Chigley called the album "un diable," empowering and hopeful and euphoric all at once, saying that it says everything there is to say about mortality and it does it in 10 tracks. Dave Simpson of The Guardian called it one of the year's best already by a mile. NME named Funeral second in their list of 2005's best albums. NME also named Rebellion, Lies, the second best track. The acclaim wasn't just from critics. Fellow musicians took notice. David Bowie said of Arcade Fire, "There's a certain uninhibited passion in the Arcade Fire's huge, dense recording sound. They meld everything from early Motown, French chanson and Talking Heads through to The Cure in a kaleidoscopic dizzy sort of rush." The band booked small clubs for their 2004 tour, but growing interest forced many venue changes, far beyond the band's expectations, and the tour continued into mid-2005 throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, the Summer Sonic Festival in Japan, and the Hillside Festival in Guelph. On its ensuing concert tour in 2004 and 2005, the group appeared at major music festivals such as Chicago's Lollapalooza and Southern California's Coachella. The band was featured on the April 4, 2005, cover of Time's Canadian edition. On May 1, 2005, the band performed at the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival. But the most significant validation came from one of the world's biggest rock bands. Wake Up was played during the beginning of U2's Vertigo Tour shows, usually followed by City of Blinding Lights. Prior to the band taking the stage, Wake Up by Canadian rock band Arcade Fire was played as introduction music throughout the Vertigo Tour. Wake Up was played immediately before the Irish rock group U2 started their concerts on their 2005-06 Vertigo Tour. Arcade Fire subsequently opened 3 shows for that tour, and at the third in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, appeared on stage during U2's encore to join in a cover of Joy Division's "Love Will Tear Us Apart." For a band that had been recording in apartments and basement studios just 2 years earlier, sharing a stage with U2 was surreal, but it also cemented their status. Arcade Fire had arrived. September 2005 brought another high-profile moment. On September 9, 2005, the band appeared on the British-US television special Fashion Rocks, on which David Bowie joined them for Wake Up. This recording, as well as recordings of the band's collaboration on Bowie's Life on Mars and 5 Years, were made available on the iTunes Music Store in a virtual live EP. The success was also commercial. By November 2005, Funeral had gone gold in both Canada and the UK, and sold over 500,000 copies worldwide, a very large number for an independent release with minimal television or radio exposure. By March 2007, it had sold nearly 750,000 copies worldwide. The album is certified gold by the Record Industry Association of America for over 500,000 copies sold in the US. The album became Merge Records' first in the Billboard 200 chart and the label's biggest-selling album to date, surpassing Neutral Milk Hotel's In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. The album produced 5 singles, with Rebellion Lies being the most successful, having peaked at number 19 on the UK singles chart. The album was nominated for a Grammy Award in 2005 for Best Alternative Music Album. To fully understand Funeral's impact, you need to understand the world it entered. The record entered a world no longer on fire, but dolefully combing the ashes for sense and reason. Inquests were in vogue, into the suspicious death of weapons inspector Dr. David Kelly the previous July, into whether Iraq had possessed the weapons of mass destruction that would have justified the Allied forces' invasion in March of the same year, into Al-Qaeda's role in the 9/11 attacks a few years earlier. In March, that very organization took the lives of 191 in the Madrid bombings. In April, photos emerged of U.S. soldiers abusing Iraqi soldiers in Abu Ghraib prison. Funeral is a record that provided a soundtrack to a generation who wanted to feel something but didn't know what, and barely remembered how. In 2004, indie rock was at a crossroads. The garage rock revival was fading. The New York scene that had produced The Strokes was exhausted. Bands were either pursuing ironic detachment or saccharine sincerity, with little middle ground. Arcade Fire offered something different, unironic emotional intensity paired with musical ambition. Stereogum's Chris DeVille dubbed it a how-to guide for grand, artful, and cathartic rock music that turned out impossible to replicate. He credited it with birthing future indie rock characteristics, including sing-songy choral work, orchestral instrumentation, and more. He also saw the album popularize arena rock's grandeur in the genre, replacing the ironic detachment of fellow indie group Pavement. A game-changing debut, Funeral has been designated as one of the most triumphant rock records of all time. Stereogum ranked it as arguably the most influential indie rock album of its time. Each track on Funeral tells its own story, but together they form a narrative about loss, hope, and the search for meaning. The album opens with Neighborhood Number 1, Tunnels, a song about children digging tunnels to meet beneath the snow. It's simultaneously about the innocence of childhood and the passage into adulthood, set against the backdrop of a frozen world. Neighborhood Number 2, Laika, references the Soviet space dog sent to die in orbit. It's about sacrifice and the cruelty of systems that send the innocent to their deaths. Neighborhood Number 3, Power Out, directly references the ice storm experience, with its refrain about going into the night to find some light. When the man sang, "Don't have any dreams, don't have any plans, I went out into the night, I went out to find some light," it sounded like he was singing to all of us. Neighborhood Number 4, Seven Kettles, continues the suite's exploration of suburban isolation and community breakdown. Then comes Crown of Love, Wake Up, Haiti, Regine's tribute to her ancestral homeland. Rebellion, Lies, with its insistent refrain about sleep being submission, and finally, In the Backseat, sung entirely by Regine, a devastating meditation on loss and letting go. In 2009, NME ranked Wake Up as the 25th best song of the decade, and in 2014 ranked Wake Up as the 25th greatest song of all time. In June 2011, Rolling Stone ranked Wake Up as the 42nd best song of the 2000s. Pitchfork's Stuart Berman saw Funeral change Arcade Fire into instant indie rock icons, helping the genre shift from a fringe movement born of economic circumstance to an aspirational career model. The album's influence extended far beyond indie rock circles. A re-recorded version of the band's song Wake Up from their 2004 debut album, Funeral, was used for the trailer of the Spike Jonze film Where the Wild Things Are, which was released in October 2009. The National Football League featured this recording in commercials throughout the broadcast of the 2010 Super Bowl. The band donated the proceeds from licensing the song to the NFL to the charity Partners in Health. Sports also embraced the music. Wake Up was played as the pre-game intro song at New York Rangers games during the 2006-2007 season. It is currently used as the intro song for Premier League club Aston Villa. According to the website Metacritic, the album had the second most appearances on end-of-decade top 10 lists, only behind Radiohead's Kid A. In the 2020 updated version of Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, it was ranked at number 500. While that might seem low, inclusion on the list at all for a debut indie album from 2004 speaks to its enduring importance. The album influenced countless artists who came after. The emotional vulnerability paired with musical ambition became a template. The use of orchestral instruments in indie rock became normalized. The idea that a debut album could be simultaneously commercially successful and artistically uncompromising was proven possible. The artwork for Funeral was designed by artist and photographer Tracy Maurice, depicting a scrolling quill with foliage growing from its feathers, painted onto a piece of a wooden planter. Maurice, then a Montreal-based artist, had been introduced by a mutual friend to Win Butler, who was looking for the artwork of the band's debut album. The image perfectly captured the album's themes: death, the quill used to write obituaries and eulogies, giving way to new life, the foliage growing from it. It was organic, handmade, imperfect, much like the album itself. Inside, the liner notes were formatted like a funeral program, with dedications. The album is dedicated to the memory of Marie-Alice Chiappini Chassagne, Nancy Turnbull Chassagne, David Perry, Alvino Rey, Louise Ray, Rose Billerman, John Dyer, Betsy Balderston, and Ruth Balderston. Funeral wasn't just a one-off success. It launched Arcade Fire into a career trajectory that few indie bands achieve. Their second studio album, Neon Bible, won them the 2008 Meteor Music Award for Best International Album and the 2008 Juno Award for Alternative Album of the Year. Their third studio album, The Suburbs, was released in 2010 to critical acclaim and commercial success. It received many accolades, including the 2011 Grammy for Album of the Year, the 2011 Juno Award for Album of the Year, and the 2011 Brit Award for Best International Album. The Grammy win for Album of the Year was particularly significant. It represented indie rock's full acceptance into the mainstream music industry establishment. The genre that had once defined itself in opposition to commercial success had achieved the highest commercial honor. No discussion of Arcade Fire's legacy can be complete without acknowledging more recent events. In 2022, 5 individuals accused Win Butler of sexual misconduct, including multiple instances of sexual assault. Butler said all contact with the accusers was consensual, and he denies all allegations of misconduct. The allegations caused significant ripple effects in Montreal's music scene. Since the end of August, the Montreal music scene has had to reckon with sexual abuse allegations against Butler. Butler responded to the allegations with a statement. "I have had consensual relationships outside of my marriage. There is no easy way to say this, and the hardest thing I have ever done is having to share this with my son. The majority of these relationships were short-lived, and my wife is aware, our marriage has in the past been more unconventional than some." Régine Chassagne gave a statement supporting her husband. "Win is my soulmate, my songwriting partner, my husband." The allegations complicate but don't erase Funeral's artistic achievement and historical significance. They do, however, add another layer to discussions about separating art from artist, a conversation that has become increasingly urgent in the Me Too era. 20 years after its release, Funeral remains a touchstone album for several reasons. First, it captured a specific moment in time. The post-9/11 malaise, the search for meaning in an uncertain world, the need for emotional authenticity in an age of ironic detachment. The album spoke to a generation that had been told not to feel too much and gave them permission to feel everything. Second, the music itself is remarkably well crafted. Despite its lo-fi production values, every song is meticulously arranged. The orchestration, strings, accordion, xylophone, hurdy-gurdy, creates textures that few rock bands even attempt. The melodies are immediate and memorable, the lyrics poetic without being obtuse. Third, the album's emotional arc feels complete. It takes you through grief, anger, defiance, joy, and finally acceptance. In the Back Seat, the closing track sung by Régine, ends with the repeated line, "I've been learning to drive my whole life." A perfect metaphor for taking control after loss, for moving forward even when you don't know where you're going. Fourth, the performances are raw and honest. You can hear the grief in Win Butler's voice when he wails on Wake Up. You can hear Régine's vulnerability on Haiti and In the Back Seat. These aren't polished, auto-tuned performances. They're documents of real people processing real emotions. If Funeral had dropped today, it probably wouldn't have the same impact. We're now a generation who have been encouraged to reach for the stars and feel what they want to feel. Our youth has been filled with the type of catharsis this album encouraged. What's often overlooked in discussions of Funeral is its technical sophistication despite its modest production budget. The album's dynamic range is remarkable. Songs shift from quiet, intimate moments to explosive crescendos. Neighborhood No. 3, Power Out, builds from a simple guitar riff to a full band assault. Wake Up moves from a gentle piano melody to one of the most anthemic choruses in rock music. The use of unconventional instruments wasn't just aesthetic, it was structural. The accordion on Neighborhood No. 1, Tunnels, provides harmonic depth that a guitar couldn't achieve. The xylophone on various tracks adds a childlike quality that reinforces the album's themes of innocence lost. The vocal arrangements are equally sophisticated. Win and Regine's voices complement each other perfectly. His raw and desperate, hers pure and vulnerable. The backing vocals throughout the album create a sense of community, of voices joining together in shared experience. And then there's the production itself. The album was recorded in an analog recording format, which gave it a warmth and texture that digital recording often lacks. The decision to embrace imperfection, to let the muddy quality of analog shine through, was crucial to the album's emotional impact. Funeral didn't exist in a vacuum. It emerged from a thriving Montreal music scene that included Godspeed You!, Black Emperor, The Deers, Wolf Parade, and others. Montreal in the early 2000s was a unique environment. The band was featured on the April 4, 2005, cover of Time's Canadian edition, which highlighted how the city had become a crucial hub for independent music. The city's bilingual nature created interesting cross-pollination between French and English music traditions. The cheap rent allowed artists to focus on their work without the economic pressure that crushed creative communities in cities like New York or London. The brutal winters forced people indoors, creating a greenhouse effect for artistic collaboration. Hotel Tutango, where Funeral was primarily recorded, was part of this ecosystem. Run by members of Godspeed You! Black Emperor, it was a space where experimentation was encouraged, and commercial concerns were secondary to artistic vision. The genius of Funeral lies not just in individual songs, but in how they work together as a cohesive narrative about grief and survival. The neighborhood suite that opens the album creates a specific world: suburban streets, winter darkness, children navigating a landscape their parents have abandoned or can no longer protect. These aren't abstract metaphors. They're grounded in the specific experience of the 1998 ice storm, but they resonate universally. Une année sans lumière, French for a year without light, reinforces this darkness, this sense of being lost in the cold. Laika introduces the theme of sacrifice, the innocent sent to their deaths by uncaring systems. Named after the Soviet space dog who was sent into orbit knowing she would die, the song asks, who decides which lives are expendable? Then, Haiti shifts the geographical and emotional landscape. Regine's tribute to her family's homeland is both specific and universal, about longing for a place you've never fully known, about inherited trauma and inherited strength. Rebellion, Lies, is the album's emotional and musical centerpiece. Its insistent refrain, every time you close your eyes, lies, lies, is both a call to stay awake, stay vigilant, and an acknowledgement that sleep, like death, is inevitable. The song builds to a crescendo that feels like defiance against mortality itself. In the Back Seat closes the album with Regine's most vulnerable performance. She sings about her mother teaching her to drive, about learning to navigate the world, about accepting that, I like the peace in the back seat. I don't have to drive. I don't have to speak. I can watch the countryside. It's about surrender but not defeat, about finding peace in letting go. One of the most remarkable things about Funeral is how it achieved both critical acclaim and commercial success without compromise. By March 2007, it had sold nearly 750,000 copies worldwide. Massive numbers for an independent release on a label the size of Merge Records. This success came without radio play on major stations, without MTV support, without major label marketing budgets. It spread through word of mouth, through Pitchfork and other online outlets, through the band's legendary live shows. The album proved that in the internet age, traditional gatekeepers were becoming less important. A band could build a following organically, and if the music was strong enough, commercial success would follow. But this success came with pressure. After Funeral, Arcade Fire had to figure out how to follow up an album that many critics were already calling a masterpiece. The expectations were enormous. Their response, 2007's Neon Bible, was darker and more ambitious, recorded in a church with a 34-piece orchestra. It proved they weren't a one-album wonder, but it also showed them grappling with the weight of their own success. A game-changing debut, Funeral has been designated as one of the most triumphant rock records of all time. Stereogum ranked it as arguably the most influential indie rock album of its time. That influence is visible across the indie rock landscape of the past 2 decades. Bands like The National, Vampire Weekend, Bon Iver, Fleet Foxes, and countless others have drawn from Funeral's template in various ways. The album normalized emotional vulnerability in indie rock. It made orchestral arrangements acceptable in a genre that had often prided itself on minimalism. It proved that you could be ambitious and earnest without being pretentious. Stereogum's Chris DeVille dubbed it a how-to guide for grand, artful, and cathartic rock music. that turned out impossible to replicate. That impossibility of replication is crucial. Funeral spawned many imitators but no equals. Its specific combination of circumstances, talents, and timing couldn't be manufactured. While Funeral brought Arcade Fire fame and success, it also came with personal costs that aren't always discussed. The intense touring schedule following the album's release was grueling. The band booked small clubs for their 2004 tour, but growing interest forced many venue changes far beyond the band's expectations, and the tour continued into mid-2005 throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, the Summer Sonic Festival in Japan, and the Hillside Festival in Guelph. For a band that had been playing to dozens of people just months earlier, suddenly performing for thousands every night was overwhelming. The pressure to deliver transcendent performances night after night, to live up to the album's emotional intensity, took its toll. Win Butler and Régine Chassagne had gotten married shortly after recording the album. They were newlyweds navigating both a personal relationship and a professional partnership under intense scrutiny. The band had gone from obscurity to having their every move analyzed by critics and fans. There was also the question of identity. They had created an album about grief and loss, but now they were expected to perform it every night, to recreate those raw emotions on command. How do you maintain authenticity when spontaneity becomes routine? The album was nominated for a Grammy Award in 2005 for Best Alternative Music Album. While they didn't win that year, the award went to Wilco's A Ghost Is Born. The nomination itself was significant for an independent release. According to the website Metacritic, the album had the second most appearances on end-of-decade top 10 lists, only behind Radiohead's Kid A. This statistic reveals the album's sustained impact. It wasn't just a critical darling upon release, but a record that critics returned to again and again as defining the decade. Pitchfork ultimately ranked the album number 1 on their top 50 albums of 2004 list, as well as number 2 on their top 200 albums of the 2000s list, after Radiohead's Kid A. The accolades continued to accumulate over the years. Various publications included it in their all-time greatest albums lists. It was studied in music schools. Academic papers were written about its cultural impact. To understand Funeral's influence, it helps to look at the numbers. After Pitchfork awarded 9.7 to the debut album by Arcade Fire Funeral, 2004, it became the fastest-selling record in the history of Merge Records. Before Funeral, Merge's biggest album had been Neutral Milk Hotel's In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, which had achieved cult status over years. Funeral matched that success in months. By November 2005, Funeral had gone gold in both Canada and the UK and sold over 500,000 copies worldwide, a very large number for an independent release with minimal television or radio exposure. But the numbers that matter most aren't just sales. They're the countless bands formed after hearing Funeral, the music students who studied its arrangements, the fans who found solace in its songs during their own experiences with grief and loss. One aspect of Funeral's success that's often overlooked is how the songs translated to live performance. Arcade Fire's live shows became legendary. With 7 or more members on stage, each playing multiple instruments, the performances were visually and sonically overwhelming. Win Butler would climb into the crowd. Régine would switch from drums to accordion to hurdy-gurdy within a single song. The entire band would join in on vocals, creating walls of sound that made even large venues feel intimate. The band performed at the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival and other major festivals, bringing their intense, cathartic performances to audiences who had only heard the recordings. The live versions of songs often extended far beyond their album lengths. Wake Up would become a 10-minute epic. Rebellion, Lies, would turn into a call and response with thousands of fans. These weren't just concerts. They were communal experiences, secular revival meetings where grief and joy could coexist. 2 decades after its release, Funeral remains essential listening for anyone trying to understand 21st century music. It captured a specific moment, post-9/11 uncertainty, the collision of traditional and digital music distribution, the search for authenticity in an increasingly mediated world. But it also transcends that moment, speaking to universal experiences of loss, love, and the struggle to find meaning. The album proved that a debut record could be a masterpiece. That indie music could be both uncompromising and commercially successful. That grief could be transformed into art without exploitation. That a band of young Canadians, recording in a converted loft space with borrowed equipment, could create something that would resonate for generations. Funeral is a record that provided a soundtrack to a generation who wanted to feel something but didn't know what, and barely remembered how. The recent allegations against Win Butler complicate the album's legacy, forcing listeners to grapple with difficult questions about separating art from artist. Can we still find meaning in music created by someone accused of misconduct? Does the communal nature of the album's creation, with Regine, Richard, Tim, William, Howard, and others all contributing, make it different from a solo artist's work? These questions don't have easy answers, but they don't erase what Funeral accomplished or what it meant to millions of listeners. The album's title, which initially seemed like a bold artistic choice, turned out to be perfectly apt. It was a funeral for multiple grandparents, yes, but also a funeral for a certain kind of indie rock, the detached, ironic, small-scale music that had defined the 1990s. Funeral buried that aesthetic and gave birth to something new, music that was ambitious, emotional, and unafraid. That 8-month pregnant woman lying on a studio floor, those young musicians recording in a Montreal loft during the hottest week of summer. That grandfather who pioneered the electric guitar and lived to hear his grandchildren create something revolutionary with the instrument he helped invent. They all created something that endures. By March 2007, it had sold nearly 750,000 copies worldwide. But numbers can't measure impact. They can't measure the teenager who found solace in the back seat after losing a parent, the couple who danced to Haiti at their wedding, the musician who heard Wake Up and decided to start a band. Funeral is an album about death that pulses with life, about loss that insists on hope, about grief that transforms into joy. It's one of the most important albums of the 21st century. And 20 years later, its message remains urgent. Stay awake. Feel everything. Don't let them put you to sleep. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Arcade Fire's, remind us that from death comes new life, and from grief comes art that endures.